Good evening, everyone, and welcome.
Good evening and welcome, bienvenidos, friends of the Hispanic Society, to our official one-year anniversary, 1 year, of the first installment of Las Tertulias de Arte Hispano, or Hispanic art gatherings, which we began in May of 2020. Thank you once again to our members who have joined us monthly for a year, and welcome to all those who are tuning in for the first time. We continue these conversations on the first Tuesday of each month at 6 p.m., like this. If you are not now a member, please do consider joining by going to our website, hispanicsociety.org, and you will find membership under support. Now, today, I have the pleasure of welcoming our new director and CEO, our new Tertulia host also, Guillaume Kientz. And Guillaume joined us in March of this year. He has served as Curator of European Art at the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth. And before that, he was the Curator of Spanish and Latin American Art at the Musée du Louvre in Paris, where he mounted highly acclaimed exhibitions on Velázquez and on El Greco, as well as the pioneering exhibition that for the first time introduced Mexican viceregal painting in the Spanish galleries of the Louvre. He is a passionate and highly accomplished advocate for the art and culture of the Hispanic world in its broadest terms, and is fully committed to giving new life to the institution, both on the world stage and in the cultural life of Upper Manhattan. Guillaume will introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Patrick Lenahan. And so, Guillaume, the pantalla, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Philippe, for this very flattering introduction. It's a pleasure to host this virtual series, and I'm pleased to introduce this very special tertulia during National Photography Month. Tonight, we will hear from Dr. Patrick Lenahan, head of the Department of Prints and Photographs, as he discusses the work of a Hispanic Society pioneer, Ruth Matilda Anderson. Dr. Lenahan doesn't need any kind of introduction. He is now a very familiar figure to most of you, for it is not the first time by far he entertains us with his amazing knowledge. But as his fan club is expanding, for those of you who recently started to follow our program, I'm happy to retrace the main outlines of his career. Dr. Lenahan received a BA from Columbia University and his PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. Before joining the Hispanic Society, he worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, first in the Department of European Paintings, and then in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts. Since 1995, he has been at the Hispanic Society of America as head of the Department of Prints and Photographs. And although this was more than 25 years ago, his passion and enthusiasm are as vivid as on the first day. He has organized numerous international exhibitions, such as Imágenes del Quijote at the Museo Nacional del Prado. And in his work on photography, Patrick has examined how images of Spain and Latin America were created in the 19th and 20th centuries and how they provide a chronicle of a way of life irretrievably lost. But now let him resurrect this incredible past and introduce to us a very talented photographer of her time and an incredible and fascinating figure of the Hispanic Society, Ruth Matilda Anderson. Following Patrick's presentation, we will have a brief conversation, and I invite you to join us by submitting your questions and in the comments section. Remember, you may submit your questions and comments at any point during this discussion. I trust you will enjoy the following presentation. I thank you for being with us tonight. I thank you, Patrick, for sharing your knowledge with us, and the screen is yours. Thank you.
Sorry.
All right. So, thank you, Guillaume, for that very kind welcome, and thank you, Philippe, for all these times before you've hosted this event. So, early in 1928, an American woman set up her camera in Plasencia on an empty street, then called la Calle de la Corredera, and took a picture. As she did this, two men rode down, passing by a building with a sign saying Fiat. Today, the photograph has a certain charm for the contrast between the riders and the advertised, if absent, cars. The photographer, Ruth Matilda Anderson, however, had taken the photograph to document the street and in particular one of the buildings, the Parador de San Juan, that faces onto it. She went on to make 6 images of the interior, recording it thoroughly. This first photograph appealed so much to me that I included it in an exhibition we organized in Badajoz in 2004. And before that, when I visited Plasencia, I attempted to find the street and the building, but I failed. What I did not know was that these pictures formed part of a chapter of the city's history. The Parador de San Juan had burned down 5 years after Anderson's visit in a dramatic fire. The family that owned it moved across the street, and their descendants grew up playing in its ruins and looking for pictures of the building. In the 1960s, the building that the city rebuilt so much and renamed the street, which then made it impossible for me to recognize it. Here you see it today in Google Maps. During these years, the owners continued their fruitless search for photos, only to find them at last in the exhibition of 2004. And if you can see my arrow here, it's only this little trace that remains from Anderson's photo. So between the change in the building and the change in the name, I think you understand my confusion. The surprise of the descendants of the owners and their joy came through in the email they sent me after they visited our exhibition. Thus, the only record of this part of Plasencia's urban history is found today in New York. That such a photo exists in the Hispanic Society and how it came to be there reflects the history of the Hispanic Society and the talent of Ruth Matilda Anderson. In particular, it points out both the appeal and significance of the photography collection at the Hispanic Society. No single photographer better embodies the museum's goals than Anderson. Yet, in doing this, she was following explicit directives from the museum's founder, Archer Milton Huntington. Huntington knew the major cities of Spain of his time and spent extended periods in Madrid and Seville. Yet he believed that the real Spain existed outside of its urban centers. In fact, he developed a profound admiration for the rural regions which he visited. For him, they evinced a genuine image that differed sharply from that formed by most tourists who saw only the sentimentalized or cliched features of the country. In keeping with his far-reaching vision of the Hispanic Society, Huntington determined that it would include a photographic archive of Spanish customs as well as art. In Anderson, he found someone who would execute this with an astounding eye and dogged tenacity. Born in Nebraska, she received her first instruction in photography from her father, Alfred Theodore Anderson, who ran a studio in Kearney specializing in views and portraits. After going to college in Nebraska, Anderson moved to New York City, where she attended the Clarence White School for Photography, from which she received a diploma in 1990. This center occupies an important place in the history of American photography. 2 years after Anderson graduated from White School, the Hispanic Society hired her. She had been working as an interior decorator when the secretary from the Clarence White School called her to tell her that the Hispanic Society was looking for a photographer and Clarence White had recommended her. The museum immediately impressed her with its vision and daring, as it seemed to capture the spirit of Spain. No less imposing was the man who guided it. As she recalled that first interview, he was tall with, quote, amused but keen eyes. He demanded excellence and hard work while admitting that it was all something of an experiment. Apparently, she satisfied him because he wondered if she could start the next day. Instead, they agreed she would begin the following week. When Anderson entered the Hispanic Society, it had been operating for more than a decade, yet it was still in its formative years. She apparently relished the opportunity to learn from Huntington. At the outset, she worked as the museum photographer, though Huntington shortly promoted her to curator of photography in 1922 when he added more staff. Then, in 1923, she traveled to Spain for the first time to take pictures for the museum. In the following years, she would make 4 further photographic expeditions in which she visited various regions of the country, some quite remote. On the first of these trips, Anderson's father accompanied her, supplying much-needed field experience. But subsequently, another Hispanic Society photographer, Francis Spaulding, traveled with her. When, in 1930, Anderson returned from the last of these, her career at the museum shifted yet again. Instead of overseeing photography, she now focused on the study of Spanish costume and published several books and articles on the subject. Finally, in 1954, she was named curator of costume at the Hispanic Society, a post she held until her retirement almost 30 years later. Throughout her professional life, these trips and photographs played an important role. Not only had she acquired vital firsthand experience, but the images furnished essential primary material for her research. As important as her research in costume is today, however, we recognize the appeal of her photographs. During her career, Anderson extensively chronicled several regions: Galicia, Asturias, León, and Extremadura, as well as the Canary Islands. In fact, these pictures account for almost 80% of her output, which eventually numbered more than 14,000 negatives. She also made shorter campaigns in Western Andalusia, Morocco, Portugal, the Azores, and Brazil, the last of these in 1948. In her photographs, Anderson recorded a timeless Spain found principally in small towns and rural regions. There she concentrated on old buildings, local industries, and the city and the community's public life, generally at festivals and religious rites. Significantly, she limited herself to those aspects of the individual's life carried out in public, such as collecting water at a well, whitewashing a house, or the exercise of a profession. Stylistically, her pictures present these daily events with a straightforward tranquility, while also suggesting an effortless naturalism. Along the way, however, many of these images, which she made to record a trade or a costume, have almost taken on a life of their own to become portraits in their own right. Although taken to record a little girl carrying a metal milk can, this picture almost captures the spirit of an era. In another case, Anderson's shot of women and girls heading off to market now evokes their indomitable spirit, carving out a livelihood in a formidable setting. In Extremadura, Anderson was documenting all aspects of the pig trade, so she went out to the fields. While she was photographing the swineherd for his costume, she recorded striking portraits of the father and son. You see here she starts and she's got the relation between them, and they're so relaxed in front of her that she can capture this wonderful interchange between the two of them. It's her painstaking approach that makes this possible. She approached her subjects respectfully, asking them about what they were doing and writing down their responses. In return, they gladly left off what they were doing to talk to her, and as they relaxed, she captured these images of remarkable spontaneity. Perhaps this is nowhere more apparent than in Monte Hermoso of Extremadura, where Anderson had visited Maxima Hernandez, a local artisan who made these prized straw hats of the town. Anderson had first seen such headgear in Sorolla's painting of Visión de España, where she understood the importance of this article. Thus, she sought out Doña Maxima so that the hat maker could explain her craft, and as Doña Maxima relaxed and talked while working, Anderson made these remarkable images of a self-confident woman plying her trade. And the photographs in turn have been very helpful to scholars of the local costume of the region who have used them as a valuable primary resource. Throughout it all, Anderson ventured into some remote areas, but even so, perhaps the trip she and her father made on November 5th to 7th of 1924 from Muros to Finisterre stands out for its difficulties. And you see, we're in the northwestern part of Spain, and you see more or less what they're doing. The goal was the lighthouse, on the point once thought to be the end of the world. And once she arrived, she took some spectacular shots. Still, getting there was an adventure. Today, one can drive this distance in a little over an hour, according to Google. But for Anderson, it took 2 days with stops. They set off down at the bottom from Muros. The first stop is here at Opindo, and then the second stop is at Thay. From Muros, one could only approach Pindo on foot or by horse. So they hired a guide, his boy, and 2 horses. As they set off with the 2 horses, Anderson's father rode on one while the other carried their luggage. When they came to the tidelands, they crossed at low tide, yet at one point there was a stream that rose to their knees. There, Ruth rode with the luggage while the man set his boy behind Anderson's father. Although the horses slipped in the water, the only casualty was their tripod, which Anderson's father fixed that evening in the Fonda at Pindo. From there, they headed on to Thay, hiring 2 women to carry their luggage on their heads as they proceeded to a ferry. In fact, as they did this, the advantage of having one's own car stood out to them, so much so that they contemplated buying one of their own on this trip. Although Anderson and her father did not do so at this point, the Hispanic Society later bought one. Here you see it, before they reconfigured it for their purposes, so that in the end, it became the body of a Fiat, the battery of a Chevrolet, and the chassis of a Ford. They affectionately called it Nuestra Señora de la Purísima Concepción, or Nuestra Señora for short, but it provided invaluable service as Anderson traveled more easily in the remote areas. Now you can see that they've reduced it from a 4-seater to a 2-seater because they want this trunk so that they can pack all their photographic gear. And the advantages as they wander into the remote areas come out very clearly in a photograph like this. But even so, some places were still too remote and they had to park the car and continue the trip on mule. I have to confess that when I began working at the Hispanic Society, I didn't know Anderson's work. But one of the great pleasures in my 26 years here has been discovering these remarkable photos and making them known through expeditions and catalogs. And beginning in 1999, we've organized a series of these photographs, with major ones focusing on her work in Extremadura, where in 2004 we held this exhibition in Badajoz at the Museo Extremeño e Iberoamericano de Arte Contemporáneo, MEAC for short. And this building is an old Franquist jail built on the site where the bulwarks of the old city wall were. And it had enormous space, which we used to great effect to put 200+ photos spaced out in a really wonderful installation. Then in 2009, we began an exhibition in Galicia, Mirada de Antaño. And you can imagine my surprise when I got off the plane at Coruña, as I'm deplaning in a jet-lagged stupor, I see the publicity for the exhibition. It's not every day this sort of thing happens to one. And I'm getting off a plane in 2009, and I'm looking at a photo Ruth Anderson took in 1924, of a bus departing Santiago. So it's a time capsule of modern transportation, though all preserved in photography. The exhibition was also, I think, very well received, and it's been traveling through Galicia. And then in 2018, we did an exhibition, Hallazgo de lo Ignorado, in Gijón, where we had the photographs in a very beautiful installation. And here, since the exhibition was in partnership with the Museo del Pueblo de Asturias, they did something very interesting, which is they created these sort of still lifes of objects that Ruth Anderson had photographed, and they arranged them near where the photographs were, so that in a case like the shoes, we were able to see Anderson's photographs and the shoes, which I think added to the impact of the photographs. I would say that although we have made great progress, we've by no means finished, and I'm pleased to say that we have more exhibitions and articles on Anderson coming up in the future. Even so, we have succeeded at making her work known in Spain. Scholars today agree that if you want to know what Galicia or Extremadura was like in the 1920s, you can do no better than to start with Anderson's work. That the Hispanic Society holds an invaluable treasure that documents this world reflects the vision of Huntington when he founded the museum and the talent of the staff he hired. Above all, it attests to the tenacity and technique of this woman whom he sent throughout Spain in the 1920s. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Patrick, for this journey, both in time and space. And I think we all look forward to seeing an exhibition about Ruth Matilda Anderson someday at the Hispanic Society here in New York. Now arrives the time for questions. So I have a couple of questions, but I'm sure that Philippe, you have many questions. I saw you being amazed as you were looking at the presentation. So I leave you the first questions.
Thank you, Guillaume. Yes, one of the questions is, you indicated in a, by the way, really fascinating presentation, thank you, Patrick, that you had 200 photographs from the Hispanic Society in one of these shows. Is that the bulk of our collection?
No, no. There are 14,000 negatives from Ruth Anderson alone, and the man in Extremadura couldn't control himself, and so we were at 200. But that was nothing. The exhibition in Galicia really got out of hand because they didn't know how to edit it down either, and we ended up there with an exhibition of 450 photographs, which is also quite a large thing, and it results in a catalog that is closer to being a phone book, although people don't use phone books anymore. So we have in total 178,000 photographs in the collection. 14,000 are Anderson's, and we pick what we can along the narrative thread of the exhibition.
Well, thank you for this answer. I have to say that every time I come to one of these tertulias or visit the institution or speak to a curator, I discover the extraordinary depth of this collection. I mean, it's just not a few examples. We're talking hundreds and thousands in many instances. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. I have a couple of other questions, and then I will let Guillaume ask his. One of them would be, what kind of camera was she using at the time? And whatever it is, do we have it at the Hispanic Society?
We don't have the camera she used in the 20s because photographers generally traded in their extant camera when they upgraded. So we have the last camera she used, which was a Graflex camera, which was a standard press camera through the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. When she made these trips, she had a film camera that took film negatives of 4x6 or a little bit larger inches, and it would have been a Kodak. We have actually got her wood tripods still. And what we do have, though, is we have the cameras Huntington used when he traveled. And that's they're an interesting set. That's a Kodak's box camera and then a small Kodak's folding camera. So we have these items which are now no longer, I mean, well, you could use them. We have the lenses, but they're not really functional in that people are doing digital photography now.
Guillaume, why don't you ask a few questions at this point?
Absolutely. Well, I would just mention cameras. I was very curious about the car. I mean, the Hispanic Society is an institution that conserves a lot of things. I'm sure that someday we will find Ruth Matilda Anderson's toothbrush. But what about the car, Nuestra Senora? What happened to it? Do you know?
No, I don't know. I assume they sold it after the 1930 trip because with the stock market crash, the impending political uncertainties everywhere, there seems to have been a sort of scaling back. There was also, I think, the understanding that 1929 to 1930 trip was sort of the final one in a series. And so I wouldn't be surprised that they sold it. It's interesting because they must have, she traveled so much that, for instance, she didn't pay income tax in the US for 1925 and 26 because she was basically almost entirely resident in Spain. So I imagine they left the car parked for 3 or 4 months, and then they came back, and because the steamboat leaves you off in somewhere in Galicia, and then you get to the car, and then you start motoring around Spain.
And do you know where the name comes from? Is that because it was a miracle to find a car at this time, or is just because the car saved their life a couple of times?
I think Ruth Anderson had a sense of humor. It was very difficult, I think, for a woman who was following a professional career in the 20s, 30s, probably even into the 60s and perhaps the 70s, to seem too frivolous. And so her writing, it only comes out occasionally in comments off the cuff in her notes. But I take it as this was an in-joke among themselves, that it was Nuestra Senora, and it was just the experience, because Ruth Anderson was, her father was a deacon in the Baptist church. She was herself a Christian Scientist. So I think she had an ambivalence as she was confronting the profoundly Catholic world she saw in Spain. And she did a very thorough job documenting Holy Week every time she visited. We have fantastic photos from Zamora, from Jerez de los Caballeros in Extremadura, and some also from other parts of Spain, so that she was very much aware of the impact of religion. So I think there was this kind of a playful side to her that we don't often see.
And the photographs are the more obvious traces that she's left from her trips. Do we have letters? Did she have a diary or something that would document those trips?
Well, that's a yes and a no. We have copious documentation in erratic format. We have a lot of invoices from some points, and from other points we have nothing. What she did that was so amazing and impressive was she took notes on the photos. And the notes she took on the photos are not the anecdotal ones that might interest us from the point of view of travel history, but they're the notes she took from a research point of view, what I saw from an ethnographic point of view. So these are the steps by which the potter makes his pot. These are the steps by which the centero makes his metal bells. And these are invaluable, particularly with regard to costume, because she noted what the materials were and the colors of them. And this sort of thing is very useful because there are people now who study the costumes. And one exhibition that we hope to resume in the future is one in Galicia, where people have recreated the regional costumes using her photographs. So in this way, her documentation is very useful. From the point of view of daily life and the anecdotes, it's actually her father who is the better source. He only went on the first expedition. So the Anderson family consisted of her father, her mother, herself, and two sisters. So when she and the father left, the family was almost half gone. So the father took it upon himself. Initially, he wrote letters, but then he had the idea that if he kept a diary, and then when this little booklet was done, he popped it in the mail. Instead of having a letter, they would be able to trace their steps and, the quaint things like, we got to this hotel and this is what we found and this is what happened. The tripod broke as we were crossing the river, but I was able to fix it that evening in the hotel, because, since the photography studio was a family business, they would understand all this right away. So that is for us an invaluable source on these particular details.
Well, this is truly fascinating. And was her father the regular companion of her trips to Spain? And what was the crew? I mean,
well, there wasn't, to speak of a crew is, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
To speak of a crew is perhaps giving it more life. There were two of them. On the first trip, it was Anderson and her father, and on the second trip, from the second trip forward, it's Anderson, and another curator at the Hispanic Society, another photographer, Francis Spalding. There wasn't room for anyone else in that car. But the idea was that when she started, she had no field experience. Her father did. And since they were in very remote regions, and they needed to be able to fix their equipment and deal with things improvising as they went. I mean, there's the case in one point in Galicia when the camera, the diaphragm where the f-stops is controlled broke. And they were so remote that there was no other photographer in the area. There was no photography supply store, but he was so good with his hands that he was able to go to a local jeweler and explain, this is what I need. And he spoke no Spanish, and this man spoke no English, but they worked it out by drawing and sketching, and they were able to make the camera operational until they got to the next town where, in fact, there was a photographer who could help them repair it in a more effective way.
Right. And I don't want to make you older than you are, but have you ever met someone who, as a very young person, knew Anderson? Is that, I mean...
Oh, yeah, that's... No, when I started at the Hispanic Society, there were people, because she retired in 1980 or 81, and she died shortly after that.
The people in Spain.
People in Spain. Well, that
you know, the
no, I have not met people who met her, but I have met people who have identified people in the photographs. The story that I began with about the Extremadura, the Parador de San Juan, has happened frequently. People recognize their parents, their grandparents in the photos, and it makes it more vivid and alive. And in one case, a local town chronicler has taken the photos back to actual subjects who were alive, and they have, this was from the 48 expedition, and they have some memory of Anderson's visit. Among the things, Anderson wanted to leave them a tip, and they didn't want, because they gave her a whole mornings of their time as she photographed their costumes from the front, from the side, from the other side, and she wanted to thank them with something, and they refused all money. So then they buried the money in a well somewhere, and the women looked, what is this? And they dug it up after Anderson left.
Okay, that's very funny. And perhaps one last question, then we can take questions from the audience. You pronounce the word ethnographic or ethnographic standpoint. My question, I know, is a tricky one, and you may say it's a vain one. But when I look at her photographs, I absolutely see the artistic quality of them, and clearly the way she looked at Spain and at Spanish people. I mean, she was looking at them through the eyes of the Spanish painters that she may have known from the Hispanic Society. And some photographs evoke to me Murillo, some other Zurbarán, some other Goya, and most certainly Sorolla, because she joined the Hispanic Society kind of the same year Sorolla finished the Vision of Spain, right? So that was contemporary art at the time. So that was very, very recent, very fresh. And it's so fascinating to see the unity between a work in Spain and what Sorolla achieved for the Hispanic Society.
Well, that is I wouldn't say it's a vain question. It's a very complex question with enough nuances for another tertulia of its own. I will, however, limit myself to three general thoughts. The first is the differentiation between art and documentary and photography is treacherous. They're not, in my opinion, so much opposites as sort of balance, as two ends of the spectrum that any photographer balances as they make the image, because their shot is designed to convey something. How they convey it is what their artistry is. And what photography is as a good friend of mine called it, these people are wizards of light, because you have to understand how the light is hitting it, how the light is going to work, and the sensitivity. And in the days of black and white film, the different colors respond to the film differently. And among Anderson's equipment that we have are a whole array of filters that she would have used at different points, so that we get these incredible landscapes where the foreground, the middle ground, and the sky are all perfectly balanced. And that's the product of a solid, rock solid technique and understanding of black and white. That brings me to the second of the points, which is her training. She was trained at Clarence White's school. Clarence White trained a whole generation of people, but in a pictorialist style of photography. They were grounded rigorously in how to organize the composition, how to create photographs that were works of art. When she came to the Hispanic Society, however, she was taught by Huntington very clearly that the purpose of the photograph was not to be soft focus and artistic, but it was to convey what the customs were, what the costumes were, what the view was. Nonetheless, you can't escape the fact of your training. And I think she unmistakably had a very good eye, because every time you put the camera up to your face to frame a shot, she had just been trained. And after a certain point, you just know how to frame it and how to do it and how to make it work. And that brings me then to the third of the points that answers you, which is the question of the Hispanic Society and Sorolla. That is certainly a tertulia in its own. And in the Tesoros catalog at the Prado, I tried to touch on that in a little bit in the essay I wrote. Anderson was hired in 1921. She describes vividly the moment when the Sorolla canvases came. We have this in her notes, and how they blew her away. And she had, at that point, already made the first two expeditions to Spain. So she had been in the field when the paintings arrived. She understood from Huntington, of course, that this was the essence of Spain he wanted to convey. Before we remodeled the Sorolla room in 2009, a large part of the photography collection was, in fact, in the Sorolla room. Anderson worked literally in the shadow of Sorolla's paintings, with her back to them. And it's not a surprise that one of her books is on the costume, when she was as a costume curator, on the costumes that she saw in Sorolla's paintings. So, for instance, in Extremadura, she made a real effort to seek out the people who had modeled for Sorolla. So one of the things I like to do when I take people to the Sorolla room is the market scene at Plasencia is not one that most people stop and spend time with. For me, however, it has a great deal of sentimental meaning. She went there. It shows a pig market. She photographed the pig market. There are people standing there whom she tracked down, and she photographed them. And not surprisingly, they're in costume not different from what they appear when Sorolla painted them. And there are, of course, those straw hats from Monte Hermoso. So the photographs match Sorolla's painting in their desire to document and record a certain image of Spain. Where we find ourselves in treacherous waters is when we start to say which is art and which is document, what is art and what is document, because Sorolla has invented and fudged things, and Anderson has also brought a strong element of artistry into her work, so that both of them are, I would say, working within their media as consummate technicians to convey something, and that they do it so effectively is a tribute to their skill and artistry.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Philippe, do you have any questions of your own? You're good. Do we have questions from the followers, from the members?
Yes, thank you all again so much for a wonderful tertulia. We have a couple of questions from our members. The first one, Patrick, is how many photographers did Archer commission for these types of documents?
Oof, that is a hard question because commission is, let me answer it slightly differently. The Hispanic Society begins its collection with when Archer Huntington as a boy realizes how invaluable photographs are as a resource. As he develops the Hispanic Society, he's very clear that there should be a photography collection and that it should be, like everything else in the Hispanic Society, comprehensive and encyclopedic. This sets him down the road of buying massively and in bulk. So this is why I'm fudging on the question commission, because he turned to all sorts of agencies. He went to literal photo agencies he went to photo dealers who worked for these photo agencies, and he had staff members travel. And it's not just Anderson, though Anderson is the most accomplished. Then there are the photographers whose work we acquired. There's this wonderful woman, Anna Christian, who was the daughter of an industrialist from Minneapolis in the flower industry, who met Sorolla, traveled through Spain, took these photographs, which are also very impressive. And she created large, soft focus, sepia-toned enlargements. And we have about maybe 800 of those. And so they're not really a commission, but it was the personal contact, the interest, the Hispanic Society that brought those in. Another case is this German, Kurt Hilscher, who was a German school teacher trapped in Spain during World War I. I think he was rather happily trapped because he didn't want to go back to Germany during World War I, where he would have had to fight. And he traveled throughout Spain, and he took about 1,600 photographs of Spain. He culled the best of them to put them in a book, The Unknown Spain, which the Hispanic Society owned. After selling the Hispanic Society the book, the German dealer who worked for the photography agency then arranged for the Hispanic Society to buy the complete set of these photographs. So they're not technically a commission, but these other two examples speak to the breadth of Huntington's pursuit of images and why we have such a diverse, they come in such diverse ways. And if you think about the times when this happens, that this is happening, in the Huntington's collecting in the early 1900s, the Hispanic Society photography collection is sort of in full swing 1920 to 40. The Hispanic Society has the chance then to buy directly from some very major photographers, specifying exactly what they want. So for instance, when Anderson travels to Salamanca and she meets a local photographer, she buys what the Hispanic Society wants from that photographer. In an odd twist of fate, the photographer's son is similarly a photographer himself, but has a difficult relationship with his father and destroys his father's negatives. As a result, the Hispanic Society now holds prints of photographs taken by this photographer that don't survive in any other format. So it's more, so these examples show, I think, how it's more than exactly the people Huntington commissioned, but I think it speaks to the breadth and it's being at the right place at the right time.
And can you remind us how many photographs do we have in the collection? Because I think so few people know about that. We're a major institution for photographs.
Well, we have 178,000 photographs. The collection of photographs, though, extends. It's Spain and Latin America. And what we've touched on this evening is really the section that includes the ethnographic photographs, the views. There's another section, which is sort of a traditional art reference collection, which includes photographs of paintings, sculpture, and decorative arts.
Thank you. Christina, do we have all the questions?
Yes, thank you so much, Patrick. I'm going to combine a couple of conservation questions. And that is, what percentage of her negatives have been printed, and how are these beautiful photographs housed?
Right. Well, the photographs were all printed when she returned from each trip. She turned the negatives over. She developed and processed the negatives as she was traveling, but they didn't print them until they returned. So everything is printed in a contact format, which means that we have 14,000 4x6, 5x7 prints. We have the negatives as well, where some negatives unfortunately have not survived their nitrate negatives and their life expectancy has come. We are in the process of digitizing them, and they're mostly digitized now. And that's where what we use now for the exhibitions, because the policy was always to make the contact prints for reference use in the building, but for any exhibition or publication, new prints would be made. And that, I think, takes us to the question of how are they housed and how are they stored. Okay.
Great, thank you so much. The next question, and I believe you touched on this a bit already, is about the costume collection. So she worked in the costume collection. Could you speak a little bit more about this?
Yes. Well, she was a curator of costume, but we didn't have costumes, not in bulk. This is the Hispanic Society had a distinction in the professional staff between those who were research curators and those who were not. At one point, very early on in the teens, there was even a curator of architecture in the sense of medieval Renaissance architecture, when we don't have any. Anderson, I think Huntington recognized Anderson's achievements, and he understood the importance of the photographs and how they had given her a window into this subject, and that this was a subject that was important and unstudied. So he ordered her to do research on this. And from about the 50s on, she publishes a book. It starts when she publishes a book on the costumes of Extremadura. She publishes a book on the costumes in the Sorolla paintings. And at the end of her life, she publishes a book which is on Spanish costume in the late 15th century, or late 15th, early 16th century. And all of these works are, for the scholars of costume, reference works now. They all know who she is. And it's a result of those years of research she did, drawing on what she had seen, whom she had met in Spain, and what she was able to read in the incomparable library of the Hispanic Society.
Thank you so much. And just one final question from a member is about Ruth Matilda Anderson traveling in Spain. So you touched a little bit about who she was traveling with, and the member is asking, it was unusual for women to travel alone in Spain at this time. So were there any observations from Anderson or from her colleagues about this?
Well, Anderson was not, it's the genius of Huntington that he, part of his experiment was in about this period when Anderson was hired, he turned to women as, for the staff of the Hispanic Society, he turned to photographers for the photography department, but he turned to librarians or people with library training to staff the museum department. And they apparently had one day a meeting where he went down the row. You're interested in painting? Fine, you're the paintings curator. You're interested in sculpture? You're the sculpture curator. You're interested in textiles? And so they went down. And these women, he understood that they would need to be trained. And so part of the Hispanic Society's history is that these women, all of them, traveled through Spain after they first had to learn Spanish and to learn what they could in the building of what was possible in the 20s, which wasn't a lot of the general history. And then they went out and they traveled to Spain to learn of the paintings and sculpture and decorative arts that they would see, and they met the scholars. And it's a real testament to his vision and to their talents and skills that as they traveled, they became pioneers and experts in their field. So Anderson, as she makes these trips, she's going into remote areas where not just 2 American women didn't go, but people from Madrid didn't even go. She went to Las Urdes in Extremadura, and the region that I showed of Finisterre in Galicia is also extremely rare, is extremely remote. But all of these women became authorities and experts, and Gay Trappier in paintings, Mrs. Prosky in sculpture. You go down the line, Frothingham in ceramics, and their works are still being used and consulted and prized. So it's she's part of a bigger part. She's a part of a bigger history at the Hispanic Society.
This is a fascinating topic, and I just want to remind our audience and members and followers that on the website we have a special programs about the women of the Hispanic Society. So go on the website, special programs, or Google women of the Hispanic Society, and you could watch some videos and get some information about that. It's a fascinating story, and I hope we will have an exhibition about that someday soon. Philippe, I thought that you had a question. You raised your finger.
That's true, yes. I have one question, which is, she was, Ruth Anderson, of course, hired and working for the Hispanic Society. But is there a body of work, of photographs that she did independently, that she did on her own personal interests, that exists somewhere or that we may have?
No.
Well, that's the longest answer you've given us today.
No, there isn't. As far as I can see, her work is exclusively at the Hispanic Society. I mean, her father obviously had a photography studio, and there's all that work. And her assistant, Frances Spalding, may have had some student work at the Clarence White School, but by and large, it's no, there doesn't seem to be outside work.
Well, then we are very fortunate, and thank you so much, Patrick, for this great and memorable tertulia tonight. We're very grateful to our community and supporters for continuing to stay involved with the museum despite the circumstances and our inability to join in person, but we will meet again in person very soon. Our next tertulia will take place on Tuesday, June the 1st. Head of Conservation, Hélène Fontoira-Martin, will present Unveiling Via Crucis, Conservation Treatment of Christ Carrying the Cross by Juan de Valdes Leal. So I hope I see you all there, and bring your friend, encourage people to join, and keep supporting the Hispanic Society. It's very important to us, and it's very important to the world. Thank you so much, and have a good night.
Thank you again.